Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So, hello everyone and welcome. This is Dharma Bum Basics. My name is Travis, I host this class. So on Tuesday night, I subbed in for Jeff and we talked a bit about dependent origination, which is one of the Buddha's most nuanced teachings. Within Mahayana Buddhism, pretty much you have emptiness as the prime example of wisdom, like an understanding of emptiness is prajna, wisdom. That's kind of generally how it's defined. But within Theravada, wisdom is defined by a working understanding of dependent origination. Wisdom or discernment is defined by understanding these 12 causal chains of dependent origination. And the important difference that I'd like to highlight between dependent origination and emptiness is with emptiness isn't something that you can come to understand by studying it. It's something that you can only come to understand by directly experiencing it. So not a lot of emphasis tends to be placed on trying to figure out emptiness, but more on emptiness kind of being this background, and you're working towards it through the meditation practice. But with dependent origination, it's something, yes, that needs to be realized within the mind, within the moment, but it's something that there's a great deal of merit and benefit comes from studying and kind of learning these 12 links of dependent origination, or the kind of the shape of the mind, or the way the mind forms itself, forms its perceptions and its opinions. So that's what dependent origination is. I'll talk a little bit more about it after the meditation, but I think we will get right into the meditation. So if this is your first time meditating, if you're sitting in a chair, it's helpful to maybe just sit towards the front of the chair, not fully utilizing the backrest, much less likely to fall asleep. Feet flat on the ground, tongue can be pressed up against the roof of the mouth, gently against the back of the teeth, prevents the buildup of saliva. And then just imagining a string kind of pulling the crown of the head up, straightening everything out, shoulders up and back, and then relaxing down into a solid posture. If you're on a cushion, that means you have a cushion at home, so you know how to sit, ideally. So with that, we'll get started. Know that throughout this meditation, the mind will wander. That's perfectly normal, perfectly fine. The important part is when we've noticed that the mind has wandered, we bring it back. That's a victory right there. It's not a defeat that we've noticed the mind has wandered. That's a beautiful thing because we can bring it back. Throughout the meditation, I'll likely be suggesting working the breath through different parts of the body. This is a perceptual exercise to spread relaxation and awareness throughout the body to areas of the body that might normally be outside our awareness. With that, we'll get started. Closing the eyes and taking 3 deep breaths slowly. Noticing if deep breathing feels good. And if it does, you can keep on breathing in this way. If it doesn't, you can switch it up. Maybe even deeper still or more shallow. Heavier or lighter. In short and out long, or in long and out short. Just noticing what feels best for the body in this moment. Once you've found a rhythm and texture of breathing that does feel good, you can allow yourself to settle down into it. Simply being with it all the way through the in breath and all the way through the out breath. Relaxing the forehead and the shoulders as you do so. As you remain aware of this in and out breath, begin to question what kind of perception you hold of breath. of breath and awareness. Do you perceive breath and awareness as two separate things? How does the experience of the moment change if you hold the perception that breath and awareness are one thing? Without awareness, you couldn't perceive or work with the breath. Without breath, awareness would die away. So they can be thought of as one thing, breath awareness. You can begin to work this breath awareness throughout the body. Focusing, starting at the stomach, and noticing how breath awareness feels in this part of the body. Adjusting it if necessary. Noticing any tension that you're holding in the stomach, in the abdomen. And consciously relaxing it all the way through the in-breath and all the way through the out-breath. With tension in the stomach and abdomen relaxed, you can gently raise breath awareness up into the center of the chest and the area around the heart. If you want, you can imagine the breath coming in straight through the heart, so you don't have to push or pull it from anywhere else in the body. Breathing in, the breath flows into the heart, soothing tension. Breathing out, it radiates out in all directions, opening the chest. With the chest relaxed, gently raising awareness up to the base of the throat and the neck. Noticing any tension in this part of the body and dissolving it away, all the way through the in-breath and all the way through the out-breath. Breathing in, opening the airway. Breathing out, relaxing the neck. Raising breath awareness up one last time into the center of the head. And as you breathe in here, you can imagine the breath coming in not only through the nose, but in through the eyes and the ears, in from the back of the head, down through the top of the head, gently flowing deep into the brain, soothing mental tension. And as you breathe out, you can imagine the breath radiating out in all directions, dissolving tension in the scalp and the forehead and the area around the eyes. With tension in the face and the head relaxed, you can allow breath awareness to flow down to fill the body. Down the arms as you breathe in, radiating out from the arms and hands as you breathe out, dissolving tension. Down the spine as you breathe in, lengthening the spine. Radiating out from the spine as you breathe out, soothing tension in the back. Breathing in, the breath comes in through the tailbone and flows down the legs. Breathing out, it radiates out from the legs and feet, dissolving tension. If we were meditating on our own, the next step would be to continue to go through these parts of the body until the mind really started to settle. But for our purposes tonight, we'll move on to the next stage, which is to take these areas that we focused on for the past session and stitch them all together. So you're aware of the entire body breathing in, and you're soothing tension in the entire body breathing out. If you want, you can imagine you're breathing in through the surface of the skin. Once again, taking 3 deep breaths slowly. And while maintaining this full-bodied awareness, you can slowly open the eyes and begin to stretch if needed. So if you'd like to share how that experience of meditation was for you, feel free to do so in the live chat over here. And if you just want to share how you're doing in general, that'd be wonderful as well. So as I had mentioned at the beginning of the class, we're talking about dependent origination tonight. And in a few minutes, I'll get into why the title of the video is a little different than dependent origination. But so on Tuesday night, we discussed it in more detail. So if you want a more detailed discussion of dependent origination, you can go check out that video. I think it's named like the 12 links of dependent origination. So you can go check out that one. But for today, I'll just go through it very briefly. And then if anyone has any questions about certain aspects of it, then maybe I'll expand upon those. But I'll go right into it. So dependent origination, the process through which the mind, through ignorance, creates itself and then creates suffering. So this is something that the Buddha noticed on the night of his awakening. And it was his understanding of this in depth, seeing it in action, that actually sparked his awakening. So that's why this is considered the discernment or the wisdom, like the heart of wisdom within Theravada. So it starts with ignorance. Ignorance is the prerequisite condition for all of the following factors. And this doesn't mean just any kind of ignorance. It doesn't mean just generally not knowing. It means ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. So ignorance of suffering, ignorance that there's a cause of suffering, ignorance of the fact that it's possible to end suffering, and ignorance of the way to do so. So that's what ignorance within this chain means. It means viewing things through a different context, because the Four Noble Truths are intended as kind of categories of perception to look at things, instead of looking at things with the perception of, which we normally do through ignorance. The perceptions that we associate with are like and dislike, mine and not mine, self and other. And that's kind of the terms in which we analyze things. I like this, I don't like that. This is mine, that's yours. I don't care about that because that's not mine. And things like that. Where with the Four Noble Truths, it takes the self out of the equation, and it just looks at things in terms of, is there a component of suffering in this? What's causing the suffering that I'm experiencing? Is it possible to alleviate the suffering? How do I go about that? So it's seeing things in those terms, applying. The Four Noble Truths are active truths, things that we apply to things that we're examining. They're not just something that the Buddha said 2,500 years ago, and then we hear them once and we're like, okay, good, got it. Ignorance means not being able to apply them in the moment, or not being able to see how they apply in the moment. The absence of ignorance doesn't mean that you just heard about the Four Noble Truths once. It means that you're using the Four Noble Truths. So from ignorance as a prerequisite condition comes fabrication. And fabrication has to do with kind of how we breathe, our inner monologue and judgments, and our perceptions. And then from fabrication comes consciousness. So ignorance and fabrication occur pre-consciousness, and then they also occur later on, because it's not just a straight line. Everything's kind of all mixed together with dependent origination. Then from consciousness, meaning consciousness being divided into like nose consciousness, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, the senses, mind consciousness. So Consciousness, from consciousness comes name and form, or materiality and mentality. So name and form means the sense that we have a body. And then name is kind of how we name things. We see a glass, we call it a glass, because we've had all this conditioning that leads to us knowing that that's called a glass. And we have all this conditioning knowing that a glass is filled with liquid and we drink from a glass. So name and form is basically our felt sensation of the body from within, or the sensation that there is a body, and then kind of our mental perceptions and labels that we place on things. Then from name and form comes the six senses. So all this other stuff occurs pre-sensory experience. So this is all the stuff we're bringing from the past into the moment. And then because we have six senses, we have these physical objects that are able to interpret senses, comes contact. Contact means like when there's a sight and our eye perceives the sight has made contact with the eye consciousness arises. So that's pretty much what six senses mean. Then six senses to contact. Contact from seeing something, if we see something that we dislike, because our fabrication, our perceptions in the past have led us to associate dislike with this, then a feeling tone arises, and it's either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. If we get contact with something that we find unpleasant, an unpleasant sensation arises. From that unpleasant sensation, then craving arises. So you have sensation, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And then craving is building on top of that. I like this, I don't like that, I don't care. If something's pleasant, we enjoy it. If something's unpleasant, we don't. And then if it's neutral, we're kind of conditioned that neutral is not okay. If we're not feeling happy, we must be feeling sad, right? But neutral is actually a pretty good place to be. But we don't latch onto that because it doesn't have any juice to it or charge to it. So these cravings come up. I like, I don't care. Craving means, it's tanha in Pali, and it means thirst. It means thirsting for something. And then after craving comes clinging. Clinging is, I believe, upadana, and upadana means to get sustenance from or to feed on. So we go from having a thirst to then feeding. You know, a thirst or a hunger, and then we start feeding. And basically that's craving is I like, I don't care. And then clinging is what piles on top of that. This is why I like that. This is why I don't like that. This is why I don't care. So it's adding on top of it. And then from that comes becoming, bhavana. But translation I like a little bit better is habitual tendency or habitual emotional tendency. And this is how this process of dependent origination filters back into the present moment. So from past conditioning, we build up this story or this reaction to an experience. And then through craving and clinging, it becomes rooted in a habitual tendency or habitual emotional reaction to something. So we have this habitual tendency, and when this habitual tendency builds enough, it leads to birth. Birth in this sense means birth of action. So you go from, the example I used Tuesday was if you see a cookie, right? So you have I meets cookie, that's contact. Feeling tone arises, pleasant. Craving arises, I like cookies. Clinging arises. I like cookies because when I was 10, my grandmother made them for me and it's a pleasant memory, and now I like cookies, right? And then becoming a habitual tendency arises. I am this person who likes cookies. If cookies are available to me, I will seek out the cookies. And then birth of action arises. I will go get cookies. And then eventually aging, illness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, despair, and suffering. That's how this chain ends. So you went and you got the cookies. You crushed an entire pack of Oreos. It felt satisfying for a minute, but then it ages. And you start to get less and less satisfied with the fact that you just ate an entire pack of Oreos. And then eventually illness, you don't feel great. Death, your desires for cookie completely subsides for that time being. And then suffering arises. Why did I eat an entire pack of Oreos? Why did I do that? I'm supposed to be trying to be healthy, blah, 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 suffering. So that's kind of this process of dependent origination, where ignorance leads to craving and craving eventually leads to suffering. Yeah. So I do have something else I'd like to share, but if anyone has any questions on any of that, I'd love to answer them or try to answer them. I'm glad this helped, Lizzie. And Marisa shared that she's doing well today. The meditation was a lovely way to emphasize that. Happy birthday, Marisa. I'm glad you could be with us tonight. So any questions or comments about this process of dependent origination? Rose shared that this process made sense to her, and she enjoyed the breathing through the skin was very calming. I really enjoy it as well. There's less of a sense of movement and more of a sense of just this calm abiding when breathing through the skin, as opposed to like a rising and falling. I really enjoy it. So if there aren't any questions, if you still have questions, go ahead and leave them down below or over there or wherever it is. And I'd like to share a little bit, because with dependent origination, it can be kind of overwhelming. There's these 12 links, and it can be kind of abstract in a sense. So one thing that I took from this was how dependent origination really just lays out in detail. It takes this process of ignorance, fabrication, consciousness, name and form, sixth sense, contact, feeling, tone, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, aging, illness, death, suffering. It takes that process, which is like lightning fast, and stretches it out into 12 chains. And for me, that's a really important insight to have in terms of how causality works and how we can work with causality if we stretch it out more, if it's not so instantaneous, speed of thought. So one thing that I've found helpful is to use this kind of causal chain, not necessarily specifically the dependent origination, but if this is, that is, if this isn't, that isn't causality, that dependent origination is all about. So, with the arising of ignorance comes the arising of fabrications, consciousness, name, and form. With the cessation of ignorance comes the cessation of fabrication, consciousness, name, and form. So anywhere within this link, if you're able to really break through to it, it disrupts the feedback loop to the rest of the chains. So often what I'll say with this is the furthest back that we can go is pretty much contact, because the sixth sense base, that's not something, it's something we're aware of, but we don't necessarily notice the moment that the senses pick up on something. We kind of notice right after it has, we don't notice hearing arising, we notice hearing after it's happening, right? So we can't really go further back than the sixth sense media or past that. So we can basically work with contact, which is when we come in contact with something. So we can work with the feeling tones that result from that. And that's why I lead this type of meditation that we do, where we check in with the body, we notice tension in the body. Because if you remember, the feeling tones lead to the craving and clinging, but if you stop any part of this link of causality, it stops the rest of it. So if we get in touch when we're having the craving, when we're having the clinging, when we're lost in our stories, if we can step back a few stages here and get in touch with where there's tension in the body, because you basically have, physically, you have a feeling tone that arises that's unpleasant, or that's even pleasant. And then craving arises, and craving can arise first physically as physical tension in the body, almost like the body's trying to grab onto what it wants. And then from that physical craving, then that mental clinging happens and we start feeding on it, right? So if we can go back to these feeling tones and we can find where tension is built up in the body and we can consciously relax that, it cuts off this chain of action that eventually ends in suffering. So it's working with this in a way that works. It's taking this principle of causality and using it to our advantage instead of how it autopilots to our detriment, right? So, yeah. So Marisa asked, would you please talk more about the difference between craving and clinging in the chain, as they seem similar? Yes. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of analyze these links. One of the ways that I enjoy the most is that the craving has more of a physical component, that tension, that tensing up, that tightening around what we want, or tensing up trying to push away what we don't want. And clinging has more of a mental component of these storylines trying to justify why we want it and why we don't want it. So craving is kind of the thirst in general, our desire in general, and then clinging is where we try to take our desire and feed on that desire. We try to use the desire as fuel itself. Then we can fantasize, as I mentioned on Tuesday, we can fantasize about what kind of cookie we want, what kind of chips we want in the cookie, what kind of toppings we want. If we want to put a scoop of ice cream on top of the cookie, God, why did I say that? And then, and we can fantasize about all of this. And that's the clinging. The clinging is when we're feeding on it. We have less control over the craving than we do the clinging. Because the craving is that tension response that I want. But the clinging is when we start the story. And we have a little more control over not getting so lost in the story than we do in not having the tension arise in the first place. So the further down you get in this chain, the easier to an extent it is to work with, up to after you've committed the action, then there's not much you can do with it, but yeah. So David asked, by disrupting these chains in the present, does it make any changes in our consciousness in the future? Absolutely, right? So this feeds back into the habitual tendency or the becoming link in this chain. If we disrupt that chain from happening, we stop reinforcing some of our more negative habitual tendencies. If we notice, for example, the one I always use, my habitual tendency to be quick to anger. If we started a reactivity journal, which is a great thing to do, and we can trace what things lead up to anger and the earliest marking of anger, we can stop there before we can work with that aspect of the chain. before anger even arises in the first place, and therefore isn't reinforced. And if we do that often enough, it weakens that habitual tendency. And then we can start cultivating a tendency towards loving kindness as opposed to ill will or anger. So by disrupting these chains, we can really change our conditioning, because that's what this dependent origination is the process through which we're creating our mind, we're conditioning the mind, so we can hijack that process for our own good. So maybe I should stop talking about cookies then, David. So he said, David plus cookies equals quarantine stress. So I did want to share something, and it's about kind of taking this, if this is, that is causality that dependent origination uses, and taking it and applying it to some of our own personality traits or habits that we're not super fond of. So this is where the name of the title of this video comes in. If I can remember correctly, I believe I titled it Codependence Origination. Applying causality to personality. I think that's it. So this codependence origination is kind of a joke term that I made up. But so dependent origination is the Buddhist teaching. Codependence origination is me working with my own tendency towards codependence. So it's something, it's like a pun. I love puns. It's something that I came to with this, noticing if it's this helpful to stretch something out like this, to stretch out something that seems to happen instantly, to be able to stretch it out and see what parts of the chain we have more control over than others, then maybe it would be helpful if I did this with some of my own habitual tendencies. So I have a habitual tendency towards codependence. And I wrote this codependence origination, which I'll read to you guys. So, and by no means is this perfect. This is something that I came to through kind of less than pleasant means, but I'll read it first and then I'll explain a little bit. So from personality attraction comes obsessive analysis of positive qualities, which leads to deification, which then leads to something I called future fantasy theater, like basically getting lost in the fantasy of imagining our life together and blah, 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 and the white picket fence and all that BS. Imagining all of that, which then leads to obsessive craving, which leads to fear, which leads to abandonment issues, because my grandfather passed away when I was very young, and I really looked up to him. He was a big part of my life. So it like instilled this kind of abandonment issue, this narrative of like, if I care too much for someone, they'll leave type of thing. So that obsessive craving leads to fear, leads to abandonment issues, and then eventually leads to an inferiority complex, because when you have a habit of deifying someone, of course you're going to feel inferior. Like that's just kind of how that works, right? And then from inferiority complex, then comes covert manipulation. If I'm not good enough for them, I need to trick them into thinking I'm good enough for them. Or even worse in the past, I don't do this anymore, but even worse in the past, I need to convince them that they're bad enough to be with me, right? And then covert manipulation leads to subconscious self-hatred, because that's a pretty crappy thing to do. Which then leads to unraveling, which then, because the mind's super unsteady by this point, leads to blatant manipulation, because covert manipulation's off the table, right? Which then leads to anger, regret, mental exhaustion, then numbness, and then repression. And then stays in that repression state until personality attraction arises again, and then the cycle starts again. So yes, that's me in a nutshell. I wasn't sure about reading that, but so basically, I took this habit that I have because it's really had a negative impact on my life multiple times throughout my life, and I really started playing investigator with it. I started investigating and really watching myself when I was getting stuck in this codependence, watching myself when I would crash and burn, being able to reflect back on that. And thankfully, because we are creatures who like to vent, and now we have these little devices in our pockets where we can vent to anyone that we want at any time, which isn't always the best thing. We also have this wonderful record, this historical record of how crappy I've been. And we can look back on past conversations and see things that we never would have seen when we were in the midst of it, when we were under the control of it. And we can see, wow, is that really how I was talking and acting and behaving? Oh my God, that's so manipulative. I didn't even notice while I was doing it that it was manipulative. And it becomes this crazy, like, how to catch a killer montage of reading through your own text messages and stuff. And it's really challenging to do. I wouldn't recommend doing it until you're pretty solid. And definitely not trying to reflect on it when you're in the midst of it. Not trying to, definitely reflect on it, notice that it's causing you pain and try to stop, but not to try to dismantle it when you're in the midst of it. But afterwards, you can look back and you can kind of piece together. And it's honestly really fascinating. It's less stressful than it is fascinating, because you get to see what you're like when you're that part of you that you don't like to recognize or acknowledge. And then you can learn how that part of you operates, where it draws strength from, where it feeds on. And then you can begin to disrupt that process, right? So in my example here with the codependence origination, same with the dependent origination of the furthest back we can go and have control over is feeling tones, noticing the tension in the body and whatnot. So I did the same thing here. Where's the farthest back I can go on here? And where's the point where I basically lose control and it just is autopilot from that point because of such a strong habitual tendency? And I found that for this, and it definitely means that there's things happening prior to this, but you have personality attraction and then obsessive analysis of positive qualities. And I found for myself, that's when stuff really starts to pick up, is when I'm obsessive about their good traits. So I'm generally a positive person. I like to see the best in people. So there's this tendency to really focus on positive traits. But what that ends up leading to is this deification, and then wanting this person, and then this inferiority complex and all this kind of stuff. So if I can cut off obsessive analysis of positive qualities by balancing it with balanced analysis of all qualities, making a pros and cons table in my head or on paper or anything to try to reason with my crazy mind. So this process, I highly recommend taking a reactivity journal like this dependent origination, using this causality, these chains for yourself to see how that works. So any questions on that, if anyone has any? Yes, none of you are alone. We all have our moments. Where did I start to do the reactivity journal? So Rose asked, where did I start to do the reactivity journal? Was it at the point of suffering? Oh, what point of the traditional dependent origination did I start to do the reactivity journal? So basically, yes, at suffering. After I would crash and burn, and my manipulation and my anger and all of that would backfire on me, and then I'd be left alone and miserable and all of that. And then the numbness would return. It was kind of in that numbness, because that numbness is comfortable enough to be able to look back on things and not be overwhelmed by it. So it was kind of when I was, after I had crashed and burned and I was just kind of with numbness, I could look back at things almost with indifference to be able to acknowledge the causal process. So yeah, so it's after you've crashed and burned, a while afterwards, when you're back on the upswing, or at least on the plateau, it can be helpful to start to acknowledge, okay, where did I go wrong? Where did I start to lose control of my mind, lose control of my situation? And then just going through all those fun text messages and emails and all of that relate to this personality trait of yours or this habitual tendency of yours. Yeah, because we have all sorts of stuff that happens in the mind, and if there's one thing that dependent origination shows you, it's that you are not what you think. Thinking is an impersonal process that, even if you were to step away, continues through these 12 chains. Continues even if you don't get involved with it, it keeps going. So just because there's bad thoughts in the mind doesn't mean you're a bad person. Just because there's good thoughts in the mind doesn't necessarily mean you're a good person. You're just a person having thoughts. So that can be a helpful perspective when we're looking back on things. David asked, do you have an outline for this reactivity journal? I probably should work on something like that. I do not. Basically just tracing it back, knowing that my issue stemmed from becoming attracted to someone, typically not necessarily having it be mutual, and then spiraling. So I would trace it back to as far back as I could attempt to go, which would be, what was it that attracted me to people? And then I realized that it's predominantly a personality attraction. I see good traits in their personality that I think would like complement my personality or my life or whatever. And then this whole chain would unfurl. So I would try to find the furthest back point I could, and then try to find the crash and burn point, and then try to fill in the blanks in between. That's what I did basically. So hopefully that's helpful. Maybe I'll work up something this month. Who knows? We'll see. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, why not? So we'll close with a transfer of merit or a dedication of merit. So yeah, I like that idea, Lizzie. Well, I'll think about it and see. Yeah, so we can join palms if comfortable. May any merit gained from this meditation and discussion be dedicated to all those who suffer at this time. May all beings in all directions, without limit or exception, be healthy, joyful, and at ease. May we all be healthy, joyful, and at ease. Metta karuna mudita peka sanga teya cetasa chaturisam bharatva viharati Sammagunarupavena Samanammarupavena Samasangharupavena Sote Hantu Nirantaram.